What if I told you that in a cold Dublin prison cell, a man's final wish before his execution would unleash a miracle so powerful that it would expose decades of corruption and forever change the lives of everyone who witnessed it? This isn't just another prison story. This is about how Our Lady of Knock answered the desperate prayers of a condemned man in ways that no one could have predicted. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about divine intervention and the power of a mother's love. In the heart of County Cork, where the rolling green hills meet the ancient stone walls that have witnessed centuries of Irish struggle, lived a woman named Bridget O'Sullivan. She was 68 years old when this story begins, with silver hair that caught the morning light streaming through the windows of her small cottage in Ballincollig. Every morning without fail, Bridget would kneel before her kitchen table, where a cherished statue of Our Lady of Knock stood surrounded by flickering candles. This wasn't just any statue, mind you. It had been blessed at the very shrine where Our Lady herself had appeared, back in 1879. And it had been passed down through 4 generations of O'Sullivan women, each one carrying the weight of countless prayers and desperate pleas for mercy. Bridget's son, Cormac O'Sullivan, was 31 years old and sitting on death row in Mountjoy prison, counting down his final days before an execution scheduled for November 23rd. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the family history. Cormac had been raised in one of the most devout Catholic households in all of Cork, where the rosary was recited every evening after supper, and Sunday Mass was as certain as the sunrise. His father, Seamus O'Sullivan, had been a respected school teacher in their village, known throughout the community for his gentle nature and unwavering faith. Bridget herself worked as a seamstress, her skilled hands crafting beautiful communion dresses and confirmation suits for the children of their parish, always refusing payment from families who struggled financially. The path that led Cormac from altar boy to death row began when he was 19 years old, working as a mechanic in a small garage on the outskirts of Cork City. Life had taken a harsh turn after his father passed away from a sudden heart attack, leaving behind crushing debts from medical treatments that hadn't saved him. Cormac, desperate to help his mother keep their family cottage, began making choices that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He started associating with a rough crowd from the north side of Cork, lads who promised easy money through activities that Cormac knew in his heart would break his mother's spirit if she ever found out. It was during a robbery gone wrong at a petrol station in Fermoy that everything changed forever. According to the prosecution's version of events, Cormac had been the one who pulled the trigger when Garda Detective Inspector Patrick Doyle tried to intervene during what should have been a simple theft. The detective, a father of 3 young children, died instantly from a gunshot wound to the chest, but Cormac maintained his innocence from the moment he was arrested, swearing on his father's grave that he had never even held the gun, let alone fired it. His story remained consistent through months of interrogation, through a trial that lasted only 6 weeks, and through 8 long years of appeals that were systematically denied. The evidence against Cormac seemed overwhelming to the jury of 12 good citizens from County Cork. There was his fingerprint on the getaway car, his presence at the scene which he never denied, and most damaging of all, the testimony of Detective Sergeant Niall Murphy, who claimed he had witnessed Cormac fire the fatal shot. Murphy, a 30-year veteran of the Garda with commendations for bravery, presented his testimony with the calm authority that comes from decades of courtroom experience. The defense lawyer, a young solicitor named Emma Walsh who had been practicing law for barely 3 years, found herself outmatched by the prosecution's resources and the weight of what appeared to be irrefutable evidence. Throughout those 8 years in Mountjoy, Bridget never missed a single visiting day. Every Tuesday afternoon, she would make the journey from Cork to Dublin, carrying her rosary beads and a thermos of tea that she shared with her son through the thick glass that separated them. She would tell him about the neighbors who still asked after him, about the masses that Father Flanagan offered for his intention every Sunday, and about how Our Lady of Knock was watching over them both during these darkest of times. Cormac would watch his mother's face age with each visit, seeing new lines of worry etched around her eyes, knowing that she was spending her pension money on bus tickets and holding on to hope when everyone else had given up on him. The transformation that began in Cormac during his 4th year of imprisonment wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was gradual, like the way dawn slowly breaks over the Irish countryside. He started attending the prison masses celebrated by Father Colum McBride, an elderly priest from Donegal, who had been ministering to prisoners for over 40 years. Father McBride never asked Cormac about his guilt or innocence. Instead, he spoke about redemption, about how God's mercy could reach into the darkest places, and about how Our Lady of Knock had appeared to ordinary people during their time of greatest need. Slowly, Cormac began to rediscover the prayers his mother had taught him as a child, finding comfort in words that connected him to something larger than the concrete walls and metal bars that defined his world. During his 6th year behind bars, something extraordinary happened that would later be seen as the first sign of Our Lady's intervention in Cormac's case. He was in his cell one evening in late September, kneeling on the cold concrete floor and praying the rosary that his mother had somehow managed to get approved by the prison authorities, when he experienced what he would later describe as the most profound moment of his life. The small prison cell, barely larger than a closet, suddenly filled with the sweet scent of roses, though there wasn't a flower to be found anywhere in the entire facility. More remarkable still was the gentle presence he felt, as if someone was standing beside him, offering comfort in a way that transcended physical touch. When he opened his eyes, there in the corner of his cell stood a woman dressed in white, her face radiant with a kindness that reminded him instantly of his own mother's love. She spoke no words, but somehow Cormac understood her message perfectly, that he should continue praying, continue believing, and that the truth would eventually come to light in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Cormac told Father McBride about this vision during their next meeting, and the wise old priest listened with the kind of attention that comes from decades of hearing confessions and witnessing the mysterious ways that grace works in human lives. Father McBride had served in parishes from Derry to Kerry. He had seen enough miracles and answered prayers to know that Our Lady of Knock had a special fondness for appearing to those who needed her most desperately. He encouraged Cormac to continue his prayers and to trust in the intercession of the Blessed Mother, reminding him that at Knock, Our Lady had appeared alongside Saint Joseph and Saint John the Evangelist, sending a message of hope to the Irish people during one of their darkest periods in history. The priest also began celebrating special masses for Cormac's intention, asking the entire prison community to join their prayers with those of his mother, who continued her faithful visits and her unwavering belief in her son's innocence. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Detective Sergeant Niall Murphy was living with a secret that was slowly destroying him from the inside out. For 8 years he had carried the weight of his perjured testimony, knowing that an innocent man was sitting on death row because of his lies. The truth was far more complicated than anyone realized. Murphy had indeed been at the scene of the robbery that night in Fermoy, but not as a witness to Cormac's alleged crime. He had been there as part of a corrupt scheme involving stolen goods and protection money, working with the very criminals who had committed the robbery. When Detective Inspector Doyle had stumbled upon the scene unexpectedly, it was actually Murphy's criminal partner, a man named Declan Burke from Limerick, who had fired the fatal shot in panic. Murphy had made a split-second decision to frame Cormac, who had been present but entirely innocent of the shooting, in order to protect himself and his criminal associates. The guilt had been eating away at Murphy's soul like a cancer, affecting every aspect of his life. His marriage to his childhood sweetheart, Mary Murphy, a nurse from Galway, had deteriorated as he became increasingly distant and prone to violent outbursts. His 3 children, twin daughters aged 15 and a son aged 12, had grown afraid of their father's unpredictable moods and alcohol-fueled rages. Murphy's career, once promising and filled with commendations, had stagnated as he struggled with insomnia, nightmares, and a growing dependence on whiskey that he used to numb the constant ache of his conscience. Several times over the years he had picked up the phone to call his superior officers and confess the truth. But each time fear had overcome his moral courage. Fear of prison, of losing his pension, of the shame that would fall upon his family name. As November 23rd approached, the date set for Cormac's execution, something began to shift in the spiritual atmosphere around the case. Bridget O'Sullivan had organized prayer groups throughout County Cork, bringing together women from parishes as far away as Bantry and Youghal to pray the rosary specifically for her son's salvation. These women, many of them mothers themselves, understood the depth of Bridget's suffering and offered their prayers with the kind of fierce determination that Irish mothers are known for throughout the world. They met every evening after supper in different homes, passing the blessed statue of Our Lady of Knock from house to house, each family taking turns hosting the prayer vigil that continued unbroken for weeks, leading up to the execution date. The prison itself had become an unusual place during those final weeks before Cormac's scheduled death. Other inmates, hardened criminals who normally showed little interest in matters of faith, found themselves drawn to join the prayer services that Father McBride celebrated with increasing frequency. There was something about Cormac's quiet dignity, his lack of bitterness despite his circumstances, and the obvious love of his mother that softened hearts that had been closed for years. Even some of the prison guards, men who had worked in the system long enough to become cynical about human nature, began to feel that there was something different about this particular case, something that didn't quite fit with their understanding of how guilty men typically behaved when facing death. On November 20th, just 3 days before the execution was scheduled to take place, Cormac received what would be his final visit from his mother. Bridget arrived at Mountjoy Prison carrying more than her usual thermos of tea and rosary beads. She brought with her the precious statue of Our Lady of Knock that had been the centerpiece of their family's devotion for generations. The statue, carved from Irish bog oak by a craftsman in Westport over a century ago, was no larger than a man's hand, but it contained within it the accumulated prayers and tears of 4 generations of O'Sullivan women who had knelt before it during their times of greatest need. The prison authorities, moved perhaps by the approaching execution or by Bridget's obvious suffering, made an exception to their usual rules and allowed her to give the statue to her son for his final days. When Cormac held the statue of Our Lady of Knock in his hands for the first time since his arrest 8 years earlier, something profound occurred that would later be witnessed by everyone present in the visiting room. The small carving, which had always been a beautiful but ordinary religious object, began to emanate a warmth that seemed impossible given the cold November air that filled the prison. Both Cormac and his mother felt it simultaneously, a gentle heat that spread through their hands and up their arms, accompanied by that same sweet scent of roses that Cormac had experienced during his vision months earlier. Other visitors in the room, hardened family members of convicted criminals who had seen every kind of prison drama imaginable, turned to stare at the mother and son who were weeping together while holding what appeared to be a simple wooden statue. The prison guard who was supervising the visit, a man named Seamus Kelly from Wicklow, who had worked at Mountjoy for over 20 years, later told his wife that he had never seen anything like the peace that seemed to surround those two people during what should have been their final goodbye. Bridget spent their last visit together, not talking about the approaching execution or dwelling on the injustice that had brought them to this point. Instead, she told her son stories about his father, about the day Cormac was born during a snowstorm that had blanketed all of Cork in pristine white, and about the dreams she had carried for his future when he was just a small boy helping her in the garden behind their cottage. She reminded him of the summers they had spent visiting relatives in County Mayo, making pilgrimages to the shrine at Knock, where they would join thousands of other Irish families in prayer before the gable wall where Our Lady had appeared. Those visits had been magical times for young Cormac, sleeping in a tent with his cousins while the adults stayed up late into the night, sharing stories and singing the old songs that connected them to generations of their ancestors who had faced their own struggles with faith and courage. As Bridget prepared to leave that final time, she pressed the statue firmly into her son's hands and whispered words that would echo in his mind during the dark hours ahead. She told him that no matter what happened in the coming days, he should remember that Our Lady of Knock had always been with their family during times of trial, and that death itself could not separate a mother's love from her child. She reminded him that at Knock, Our Lady had appeared not with words of judgment or condemnation, but with a message of hope and comfort for people who were suffering under circumstances beyond their control. The statue, she explained, had been present at her own mother's deathbed, at the birth of each of her children, and through every crisis that the O'Sullivan family had faced over the past century, and now it would be with Cormac during his greatest hour of need. The night of November 22nd passed slowly in the death row section of Mountjoy Prison. Cormac lay on his narrow bed, holding the statue against his chest and reciting the prayers his mother had taught him as a child. Prayers that seemed to take on new meaning when spoken in the shadow of approaching death. Sometime around midnight, he began to experience phenomena that would later be difficult for anyone to explain or understand. The statue in his hands grew noticeably warmer, not uncomfortably hot, but with a gentle heat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. More remarkably, a soft light began to emanate from the carved wood, starting as barely perceptible glow, but gradually increasing in brightness until it illuminated the entire cell with a golden radiance that resembled candlelight, but came from no identifiable source. The prison guard making his rounds at midnight was a young man named Paddy O'Brien from County Clare, new to the job, and still nervous about working the night shift in such a grim environment. When he reached Cormac's cell and saw the light streaming through the bars, his first thought was that the prisoner had somehow managed to obtain matches or a lighter, a serious security violation that could result in punishment for both the inmate and the guard, who had failed to prevent it. But as O'Brien approached the cell and peered through the bars, he realized that the light was coming directly from the small statue that Cormac held in his hands. The young guard stood frozen for several minutes, trying to process what his eyes were telling him, while his rational mind searched for a logical explanation that simply didn't exist. O'Brien immediately radioed for his supervisor, a veteran prison officer named Michael Byrne, who had worked at Mountjoy for 35 years and prided himself on having seen everything that prison life could possibly offer. When Byrne arrived at the cell and witnessed the statue glowing with its mysterious light, he found himself speechless for the first time in his professional career. The two guards stood together in the corridor, watching as Cormac knelt in his cell, completely absorbed in prayer, seemingly oblivious to the miracle that was occurring in his hands. Byrne, a practical man from Dublin who had never been particularly religious, found himself making the sign of the cross for the first time since his childhood, moved by something he couldn't name or explain. Word of the miraculous light spread quickly through the prison's night shift staff, and within an hour, a small crowd of guards, administrators, and even some inmates from nearby cells had gathered to witness what was happening in Cormac's cell. Father McBride was called from his residence at 3 a.m. and arrived at the prison still wearing his pajamas under his heavy coat, his silver hair disheveled from sleep. When the elderly priest saw the glowing statue, he immediately fell to his knees in the corridor, his voice trembling as he began to recite the prayers to Our Lady of Knock that he had known since childhood. The sight of the respected priest kneeling on the cold prison floor had a profound effect on everyone present, transforming what might have been mere curiosity into something approaching reverence. As dawn broke over Dublin on November 23rd, the day that was supposed to be Cormac O'Sullivan's last on earth, the miraculous light emanating from the statue of Our Lady of Knock had not diminished. If anything, it seemed to grow brighter as the morning progressed, visible even in the daylight that streamed through the small window of the death row cell. The prison warden, a stern man named Thomas Gallagher, who had overseen dozens of executions during his career, arrived at work that morning to find his orderly institution transformed into something resembling a pilgrimage site. Guards who should have been focused on security protocols were instead gathering around Cormac's cell, some praying quietly, others simply staring in wonder at the phenomenon that defied all rational explanation. Even more disturbing to Gallagher's sense of order was the fact that several guards had called in sick that morning, apparently unable to face participating in the execution of a man who seemed to be receiving such obvious signs of divine favor. The news of the glowing statue had somehow leaked beyond the prison walls, despite strict orders from Gallagher that no one was to speak of what they had witnessed. By mid-morning, a crowd had begun to gather outside Mountjoy Prison, starting with a few elderly women from nearby parishes who had heard whispers about a miracle occurring within the prison walls. These women, many of whom had been part of Bridget O'Sullivan's prayer groups, arrived carrying rosaries and statues of their own, kneeling on the cold pavement outside the prison gates to pray for Cormac's intercession. As word spread through the close-knit network of Dublin's Catholic community, the crowd continued to grow, eventually including families with young children, priests from various parishes, and even some Protestant ministers who had heard about the extraordinary events and felt called to witness what might be a genuine miracle. Inside the prison, Detective Sergeant Niall Murphy was experiencing the most profound spiritual crisis of his life. He had arrived at Mountjoy that morning as a witness to the execution, a standard procedure for the investigating officer in capital cases, but found himself unable to concentrate on anything except the guilt that was tearing him apart from the inside. Murphy had spent the previous night drinking heavily, trying to numb the knowledge that in a few hours, an innocent man would die because of his lies, but the alcohol had only intensified his torment. When he heard other officers talking about the miraculous light in Cormac's cell, something inside him began to crack, like ice breaking up on the River Liffey during the spring thaw. He found himself walking toward the death row section of the prison, drawn by forces he couldn't understand or resist. When Murphy reached the corridor outside Cormac's cell and saw the statue glowing in the condemned man's hands, the carefully constructed wall of denial and rationalization that had protected his conscience for 8 years finally collapsed completely. He began to tremble uncontrollably, his legs giving way beneath him as he fell to his knees on the cold linoleum floor of the prison corridor. The other guards and officials who were present turned to stare at the detective who had been instrumental in securing Cormac's conviction, watching in amazement as tears began to stream down the face of a man known throughout the Gardaí for his toughness and emotional control. Murphy tried to speak, but at first only sobs emerged from his throat, the kind of deep, wrenching cries that come from a soul in agony. Finally, Murphy managed to find his voice, and the words that came out shocked everyone who heard them. He confessed right there in the prison corridor that his testimony during Cormac's trial had been completely false, that he had never seen Cormac fire the shot that killed Detective Inspector Doyle, and that the real killer was Declan Burke, who had died in a car accident in Limerick 3 years earlier. Murphy's confession came pouring out like water from a burst dam, years of suppressed guilt and shame flooding forth in a torrent of words that left everyone present stunned and struggling to comprehend the implications of what they were hearing. He explained about his involvement with criminal elements, about the corruption that had led him to frame an innocent man, and about the 8 years of torment that had nearly destroyed his sanity. Warden Gallagher, a man who had prided himself on running an efficient and orderly institution, found himself facing a situation unlike anything in his 30 years of prison administration. The execution was scheduled to take place in less than 6 hours. All the legal requirements had been met. The executioner was already on his way from Belfast. And yet here was the key witness in the case confessing that his testimony had been perjured. Gallagher immediately contacted the prison's legal counsel, who in turn notified the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Minister of Justice, and eventually the President of Ireland himself. Within hours, a team of senior legal officials, investigators and government ministers was racing toward Mountjoy Prison, while emergency injunctions were being filed to halt the execution, pending a complete review of Murphy's explosive revelations. The investigation that followed Murphy's confession moved with unprecedented speed, driven by the urgent need to determine the truth before an irreversible mistake could be made. Murphy voluntarily submitted to extensive questioning, providing details about his criminal activities and the circumstances surrounding Detective Inspector Doyle's death that could be verified through police records and witness statements. His story was corroborated by physical evidence that had been overlooked or misinterpreted during the original investigation, including security camera footage from nearby businesses that showed Declan Burke at the scene, and phone records that documented communications between Murphy and Burke on the night of the murder. Within 48 hours, a panel of senior judges had reviewed all the evidence and concluded that Cormac O'Sullivan had been wrongfully convicted of a crime he did not commit. The formal exoneration of Cormac O'Sullivan came on November 26th, exactly 3 days after what should have been his execution date, marking the end of the most remarkable miscarriage of justice in the history of the Irish legal system. The statue of Our Lady of Knock, which had glowed continuously for over 72 hours, finally returned to its normal appearance at the exact moment that the Minister of Justice signed the official papers declaring Cormac's innocence and ordering his immediate release. Father McBride, who had maintained a prayer vigil at the prison throughout the entire ordeal, later described this timing as the most perfect example of divine intervention he had witnessed in his 4 decades of priesthood. The elderly priest had seen enough of life and death to recognize the hand of God when it moves so clearly in human affairs, and he spent the remainder of his years telling anyone who would listen about the miracle that had saved an innocent man's life through the intercession of Our Lady of Knock. The scene outside Mountjoy prison when Cormac finally walked free was unlike anything Dublin had seen in generations. Thousands of people had gathered during the days following Murphy's confession, drawn by news reports about the miraculous events that had unfolded within the prison walls. When the gates finally opened and Cormac emerged, supported by his mother and accompanied by Father McBride, the crowd erupted in prayers of thanksgiving that could be heard for miles around. Bridget O'Sullivan, who had aged visibly during her son's 8 years of imprisonment, seemed to shed decades in that moment, her face glowing with a joy that matched the miraculous light that had saved her son's life. She clutched the statue of Our Lady of Knock to her chest as reporters and well-wishers pressed around them, her tears of gratitude falling onto the carved wood that had been their family's source of strength through the darkest period of their lives. The impact of Cormac's exoneration rippled far beyond his individual case, triggering a comprehensive review of the Irish justice system and leading to reforms designed to prevent similar miscarriages of justice in the future. Detective Sergeant Niall Murphy, whose confession had made the miracle possible, faced criminal charges for perjury and corruption, but his cooperation with authorities and obvious remorse led to a relatively lenient sentence of 5 years in prison. More importantly, Murphy used his remaining years to become an advocate for police reform and criminal justice transparency, speaking publicly about the dangers of corruption and the importance of maintaining integrity, even in the face of difficult circumstances. His transformation from corrupt officer to crusader for justice became almost as remarkable as the miracle that had exposed his crimes, demonstrating how Our Lady of Knock's intervention had brought redemption, not just to the innocent man she had saved, but also to the guilty man whose conscience she had finally awakened. The investigation that followed Murphy's confession also revealed a network of corruption within certain elements of the Gardaí that had been operating for years, involving drug money, protection rackets, and the systematic suppression of evidence in cases that might have exposed their criminal activities. Declan Burke, the real killer of Detective Inspector Doyle, was revealed to have been a key figure in this corruption ring, working as an informant while simultaneously planning robberies and other crimes with the protection of corrupt officers like Murphy. The exposure of this network led to the largest internal investigation in the history of the Irish police force, resulting in dozens of arrests, early retirements, and a complete overhaul of oversight procedures designed to prevent such corruption from taking root again. For Cormac himself, the transition from death row to freedom was both miraculous and challenging, requiring him to rebuild a life that had been suspended for 8 years while the world continued to change around him. The Irish government provided substantial compensation for his wrongful imprisonment, money that Cormac used to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting other victims of wrongful conviction and their families. Working closely with legal experts and advocacy groups, the foundation developed new protocols for investigating potential miscarriages of justice and provided financial support for families struggling with the costs of lengthy appeals processes. Have you ever witnessed what seemed impossible become possible through the power of prayer, or found hope in the darkest moments when everything seemed lost? Your stories matter, and by sharing them, You help build a community of faith that supports and encourages everyone who visits this channel. Don't forget to share this video with family and friends who might need to hear this message of hope, because you never know whose life might be transformed by learning about the miraculous power of Our Lady of Knock's maternal love and the truth that no situation is ever too desperate for divine intervention to change everything in ways we could never imagine. Cormac also became a powerful voice for criminal justice reform, using his experience to highlight the flaws in the system that had nearly cost him his life, and to advocate for stronger safeguards against police corruption and prosecutorial misconduct. The statue of Our Lady of Knock that had played such a central role in exposing the truth was eventually examined by religious authorities, scientific experts, and medical professionals, all of whom confirmed that the light phenomenon could not be explained by any known natural causes. The carved wood showed no signs of having been altered or tampered with, contained no electrical components or chemical substances that could have produced illumination, and had returned to completely normal appearance after Cormac's release. The Catholic Church eventually declared the events at Mountjoy Prison to be a genuine miracle, the first officially recognized apparition of Our Lady of Knock outside the original shrine site in County Mayo. This recognition brought thousands of additional pilgrims to visit the statue, which Cormac and his mother eventually donated to the National Shrine at Knock, where it remains on display as a testament to the power of maternal intercession and divine mercy. The broader impact of the Mountjoy miracle, as it became known throughout Ireland and beyond, extended far into the international community of Catholics, who saw in the story a powerful reminder of Mary's ongoing presence in the world and her special concern for those who suffer injustice. Churches throughout Ireland began organizing annual pilgrimages to Knock specifically to pray for prisoners, crime victims, and all those affected by failures of the justice system. The story was retold in dozens of languages, inspiring similar advocacy efforts in countries around the world where wrongful convictions and police corruption remained serious problems. Perhaps most importantly, the miracle provided hope to countless families who were struggling with their own experiences of injustice, demonstrating that no situation is so hopeless that divine intervention cannot transform it. In the years that followed his miraculous exoneration, Cormac O'Sullivan discovered that his experience had given him a unique perspective on both suffering and redemption that resonated with people from all walks of life. He married a wonderful woman named Siobhan Kelly, a nurse from Galway, who had followed his story in the newspapers and eventually reached out to offer her support during his adjustment to freedom. Their wedding, celebrated at the shrine of Our Lady of Knock, drew thousands of pilgrims who had been touched by the miracle and wanted to witness this joyful continuation of a story that had begun in such darkness. Siobhan brought to their marriage not only her own deep faith and compassion, but also a practical understanding of trauma and healing gained through her work, caring for patients who had faced life-threatening illnesses. Together, they created a home filled with the kind of love and laughter that Cormac had thought he would never experience. Blessed with 3 children, who grew up knowing they were living proof that miracles really do happen when families never stop praying. Bridget O'Sullivan lived to see her son's complete rehabilitation and the joy of holding her grandchildren in her arms, a happiness that she had never dared to hope for during those dark years when death row seemed like the end of their family's story. She remained active in the prayer groups that had supported Cormac throughout his imprisonment, but now their focus shifted to supporting other families facing similar crises and organizing pilgrimages to Knock for people who were struggling with seemingly impossible situations. Bridget's testimony about the power of persistent prayer became legendary throughout County Cork and beyond, inspiring countless mothers who were dealing with their own wayward or troubled children to never lose hope in the intercession of Our Lady. She passed away peacefully at the age of 83, surrounded by her son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren, holding the same rosary beads that had sustained her through her greatest trial, and smiling as she repeated the words that had become her life's motto. Our Lady never abandons her children. No matter how dark the night may seem, the transformation of Detective Sergeant Niall Murphy proved to be almost as remarkable as the miracle that had exposed his lies. demonstrating that divine mercy extends even to those who have caused great harm through their own moral failures. During his 5 years in prison, Murphy experienced what he described as a complete spiritual awakening, participating in every religious program available to inmates, and eventually becoming a lay minister who helped other prisoners deal with guilt, addiction, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives after making terrible mistakes. Upon his release, Murphy dedicated himself to police reform advocacy, traveling throughout Ireland and internationally to speak about corruption prevention and the importance of maintaining ethical standards even under pressure. His marriage, which had nearly been destroyed by his years of deceit and guilt, was slowly rebuilt through counseling, prayer, and his wife Mary's extraordinary capacity for forgiveness, providing hope for other families dealing with the aftermath of betrayal and moral failure. The legal and social reforms that grew out of the Mountjoy miracle created lasting changes in Irish society that extended far beyond the criminal justice system. The case highlighted the need for better support systems for families of both crime victims and those accused of crimes, leading to the establishment of victim advocacy programs and legal aid services that provided more comprehensive assistance to people navigating the complex legal system. Police training programs were completely overhauled to include extensive ethics components and ongoing psychological evaluation to identify officers who might be susceptible to corruption or excessive stress. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrated the power of grassroots advocacy and community prayer in bringing about social change, inspiring countless other movements for justice and reform that used similar combinations of legal action, public pressure, and spiritual commitment to address various forms of institutional failure. Father McBride, who had ministered to Cormac throughout his imprisonment and witnessed the miraculous events firsthand, spent his remaining years documenting the story and its aftermath, working with historians and theologians to ensure that the lessons of the Mountjoy miracle would be preserved for future generations. His detailed records of the events, including interviews with all the major participants and scientific analysis of the miraculous phenomena, became the foundation for numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies that examined both the spiritual and social dimensions of the case. The elderly priest, who passed away at the age of 91, was remembered not only for his role in the miracle, but also for his lifelong dedication to serving those whom society had forgotten or rejected, embodying the kind of compassionate ministry that made divine intervention possible in places where hope seemed to have disappeared completely. The annual commemoration of the Mountjoy miracle became one of Ireland's most important religious observances, drawing pilgrims from around the world who came to pray for their own intentions and to witness the ongoing power of Our Lady of Knock's intercession. The shrine that was established at the prison site, now converted to a center for criminal justice education and reform, became a place where families affected by crime, wrongful conviction, and police corruption could find both spiritual comfort and practical assistance. The statue itself, enshrined at Knock, continued to be associated with miraculous healings and answered prayers, particularly those involving situations where justice seemed impossible to achieve through ordinary means. Each year on November 23rd, the anniversary of what should have been Cormac's execution date, thousands of people gather to celebrate not only his survival, but also the broader truth that no human institution is so powerful that it cannot be transformed by divine intervention. When people of faith refuse to give up hope, the legacy of the Mountjoy miracle continues to inspire new generations of Catholics and people of other faiths who find in the story a powerful reminder that prayer, persistence, and faith in divine mercy can overcome even the most overwhelming obstacles. Legal scholars study the case as an example of how grassroots advocacy can expose institutional failures and bring about systemic reform, while theologians point to it as evidence of Mary's ongoing maternal concern for those who suffer injustice in all its forms. For ordinary believers struggling with their own seemingly impossible situations, the story provides both comfort and encouragement, demonstrating that Our Lady of Knock continues to appear wherever her children need her most desperately, bringing light into darkness and hope into despair through the power of a mother's love that knows no limits. If this story has touched your heart the way it touched mine in the telling, I'd love for you to become part of our community here by subscribing to our channel and joining the thousands of people who gather here each week to share stories of faith, hope, and divine intervention. Take a moment to share in the comments below what resonated most deeply with you about Cormac's story. Or perhaps tell us about a time when you experienced Our Lady's intercession in your own life, or the life of someone you love.